Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for some of you maybe. Welcome to the LLPA Skill Talk. Get ready for the new Windows Server hybrid certification. My name is Peter Kesten. I'm the chairman and co-founder of the leading Learning Partners Association, the LLPA. And before I'm going to introduce our special guest, Orin Thomas, let me start with some housekeeping. First of all, please do not hesitate to share your ideas, your thoughts, your questions in the chat window, and we will do our best to address everything. Secondly, the recording of this skill talk will be shared with you within 48 hours, so please look out for this information so you can rewatch the skill talk. And last but not least, at the end of the skill talk, we will launch a survey, and it would be great if you tell us what you thought of this whole event and whether it was useful for you. But let me start with introducing Orin. Orin Thomas, he is the author of more than 40 Microsoft Press textbooks, and he is the principal hybrid cloud advocate at Microsoft. And he joins us this morning all the way from the greater Melbourne area to share some great insights regarding the new Windows Server hybrid at. So I saw I was muted for this sentence. Orin is joining us from Melbourne, and he's sharing some great insights regarding this new Windows Server Hybrid Administrator Associate certification that is set to release this December. And Orin recently completed his Master of Computing Research at the Charles Sturt University, and he was a special guest on the Mary Jo Foley podcast. And as a recognized cloud and data center expert, he authored video-based training and instructor-led training for Microsoft Learning. So it's good to have you here, Orin. Good morning. Well, I think it's good afternoon or maybe even good evening with you. I'm not sure. Almost evening maybe. But like I said, it's great to have you here. And I'm really looking forward to the experiences that you will share with us and all of the attendees in this skill talk. But before you get started, I have a burning question for you, and that is,
Go.
why did it take so long? Why did it take Microsoft so long to launch a Windows certification since MCSA Windows Server 2016, while not releasing a certification for Windows Server 2019, but now developing one again for Windows Server 22? Why did it take so long?
So the answer to that is that anybody who's been taking recent Microsoft certifications has noticed that most of them are very cloud focused, and that we've moved away from strictly on-premises certifications. Now, it's not that we didn't intend to come back to Windows Server. It's just that we wanted to be able to frame Windows Server in a hybrid and cloud context. And that was really only possible once a certain suite of technologies, such as Azure Arc, things like Azure File Sync, and a lot of the technologies that I'll talk about today actually became available. So if we tried to introduce this certification with the release of Windows Server 2019 3 years ago, we would not have had that hybrid story there, and the certification would have had to have looked a lot like the Windows Server 2016 certification. And those of you that have used Windows Server just on-prem will know that there isn't really a great substantive difference between Windows Server 2016 and 2019, and to an extent 2022. There are small feature improvements, but a lot of the bigger features, a lot of the newer things, Windows Admin Center, all of the hybrid stuff has come much more recently and developed a lot more recently. So in terms of why now, it was really a matter of, well, we have all of these hybrid technologies that are now reaching a certain level of maturity. We also now have, with the release of Windows Server 2022, what we call a click pointing time release of the Windows Server operating system, and these two aligned. So we missed Windows Server 2019, but if you had Windows Server 2016 skills, you were 99% of the way there anyway. And what we've then done is we've refocused this certification to talk not only about all of those important on-premises roles and features and tasks that you need to perform, but also how you perform those in what most of us are living in now, which is in a hybrid environment.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. And one more question before I let you do your talk. Well, we're referring to it as Windows Server 22, right? I mentioned it, you mentioned it, but we noticed that in the certification, in the role-based certification, there's no versioning in the name. Can you explain a little bit more about why is there no versioning in the name and why there is such a big focus on the hybrid?
So in terms of the versioning, as I said, the differences really, I mean, if we were going back to the old way of naming things, we had 2008 and then 2008 R2 and then 2012 and 2012 R2. And one of the jokes that we have is that Windows Server 2022 might be thought of as Windows Server 2016 R3. And that if you're actually using your Active Directory environment on Windows Server, you'll be not able to promote your Active Directory domain or forest beyond the Windows Server 2016 level. We haven't introduced a new domain functional level because there is no difference in what the basic Active Directory functionality is. So what we recognize is that going forward, you're not going to see revolutionary changes in Windows Server. So the next version of Windows Server, which we can naturally assume that they're released, let's say every 3 years. It might not be every 3 years, but we'll assume that it is, that Windows Server 2025 comes out. Is there going to be a substantive difference in what Active Directory does or file servers do or systems? No. In fact, other than certain features such as secure core in Windows Server, there's a couple of things that have changed. It's not a monumentally different release. It's certainly not like the difference between Windows 10 and Windows 11, where you would have a different certification because there's some functionality changes there. So that's one of the reasons is that really going forward, we're not seeing the release of a particular edition of Windows Server as being as monumental. It's if you've been looking at the way that we were releasing sort of feature updates and regular updates to Windows Server, it's sort of been on an evolutionary path. But what the difference is, if you go and deploy Windows Server 2022, you know that that particular version of Windows Server has a supported lifespan. And that's probably the most important thing about it, that if you look at Windows Server 2022, you can already see when that is going to fall out of support. And that the next version, 2025, you can make an educated guess as to when that's going to fall out of support. So what was the second part of your question about hybrid?
Well, why there is such a strong focus on the hybrid? But I think you partly answered that question already. But
simply because people are using it a lot more. And hybrid is very much a matter of using as much or as little cloud as suits your organization. So a lot of organizations have transitioned to using Office 365 or Microsoft 365. And primarily that will be that they've migrated their Exchange off-prem, that they're running Exchange online in the cloud, and that means automatically that they've got some sort of hybrid identity synchronization in place, that they're sitting there starting to run workloads in the cloud. It might be Exchange, or that they're sitting there thinking, you know what, we've got this perimeter network. We've got to go and maintain this external firewall and then have this special network that's sitting between the internet and our internal network that we've got to manage. You know what, we could just shove that in the cloud and then have all of the availability there. And then that, again, is hybrid. So there's all of these little things that you can plug in that run better in the cloud that enhance your on-premises network. And that's really what we want to get across with the idea of hybrid. There's a perception that everybody wants to replace what you've got on-prem with what you've got in the cloud. And some vendors who are just cloud-only vendors are absolutely selling that path. They're saying you can get rid of everything on-prem, you only need to be in the cloud. But that's not where most organizations are. Most organizations want to keep a good degree of their on-premises infrastructure. They want to adopt cloud technologies where it makes sense for them, and it might be their new workloads that they want to run in their cloud or test workloads, but that they want to keep their existing workloads right near them. It's a lot easier to copy a 100 gigabyte file off your desktop to the file server that's sitting down the hall than it is to copy it to a cloud file share that's sitting in a data center, 100 or 200 kilometers away.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that. And I'm pretty sure that the people we have now in the call are really looking forward to learn more about this hybrid certification, this Windows Server hybrid certification, and the exams and the courses in it. So please enlighten us. Please tell us what you can share with us about these new certifications, of which I believe the exams have gone into beta right now, right? But you will probably address that as well.
Yes,
please take it away.
Okay, so the beta actually started yesterday. So that for the next until January 10th, you can take both beta exams. And if you're very quick, what you can do is if you go to the Microsoft Learn website, the Microsoft Learn blog, they've just put up a post, and I'm now just sharing with you my set of slides. They've just put up a post that's actually got 2 exam codes on it. Now, there's only 300 exam codes per exam, and this has been out for a day or two, and I already know that there's a lot of people that have already booked in their exam. But if you're booking your exam and you use one of these exam codes, you'll get 80% off. If you're already in MCT, and obviously this is a learning association, if you're already a Microsoft certified trainer, of course you get 75% off on your exams. So between now and January 10, you can take these exams and you can do them in beta, which means you won't get your result, but it means that you will also be one of the first to achieve this certification. So let's talk about the certification itself. The certification's name is the Windows Server Hybrid Administrator Associate. Now, what the Windows Server Hybrid Administrator Associate certification is it's made up of 2 exams. It's made up of AZ800, administering Windows Server Hybrid Core Infrastructure, and AZ801, configuring Windows Server Hybrid Advanced Services. Now, the only reason that this is split across 2 exams was that there was simply so much material, we couldn't actually cover it in one. So you have to do 2 exams. Now, 2 exams for a Windows Server certification is actually the fewest that you've ever been required to do. If I go back to when I got my first NT4 MCSE, there was 6 exams involved. I think there was 5 in Windows 2000, and it's usually been 4 or 5 the whole way along. That you need a couple to go and get the MCSA certification, and then you need a couple of more to go and get the equivalent of the MCITP or the MCSE, whatever it's called. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the presentations, I'm going to go through each of the bits of exam content and sort of call out how each exam is structured. So if you're thinking about preparing for this exam, if you go and search for study guides or Microsoft study guides or just my name, Orin Study Guides, on Microsoft's blog on Tech Community, I've actually published 2 study guides for this exam, or for both of these exams, that includes all of the original docs.microsoft.com references and also includes all of the Microsoft Learn modules that you can take to cover all of the material that's related to this exam. Okay, so the first exam, AZ800, and I recommend that you take this first, covers all of the hybrid core infrastructure. Now, what we mean by hybrid core is that this is your standard roles and features that pretty much everybody has in some way deployed in their organization. So the first of these, and I'm going to go into slightly more detail on each of these, is about Active Directory and identity. So how do you do identity on premises and in the cloud? And then we move on to how do you manage your Windows Server workloads, be they on-prem or in the cloud? How do you manage your compute resources, be they on-premises virtual machines and containers running in Hyper-V, or on-premise or cloud-based virtual machines and containers running in Azure. We'll talk about then networking as a core part of your infrastructure, and then we'll do storage. So you've got identity, management, compute, storage, and networking. So this first one, the second one, sorry, is advanced services. And advanced services, we've got security, high availability, disaster recovery, migration, and then monitoring and troubleshooting. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into the details of each of these areas, starting with identity. So this first one, deploy and manage Active Directory domain services in on-premises and cloud environments. So the first part of this functional group, or the first objective, is deploy and manage Active Directory domain services, domain controllers. So very much something we've been asking you about right back to the Windows Server 2000 certifications. And we look at, or the exam will test you on your ability or understanding of deploying and managing domain controllers on premise. So that's where you start. But what if you were thinking about deploying a domain controller as a virtual machine in Azure? What are the things that you need to take into account there? What about deploying read-only domain controllers? Where is it appropriate to deploy a read-only domain controller? Why would you deploy a read-only domain controller? Does it make sense, for example, to treat an Azure virtual network connected by VPN to your on-premises site as a remote site and put an RODC in that site and let items or workloads in that virtual network authenticate using that? And then troubleshooting your flexible single master operations roles, which are the PDC emulator, the RID master, the domain naming master, knowing what those roles do, and then being able to, for example, let's say that your symptoms are that you can't create new user objects. Which of those FSMO roles has failed? You should know that, which one issues the appropriate identifiers, so which one might have failed. Or if it's failed, what is the process of recovering that role? The next one, configuring and managing multi-site, multi-domain, and multi-forests environments. This is about understanding domains and forests and trusts. It's also about understanding how replication works and Active Directory sites work. So anybody who's played around with Active Directory knows that if you've got a whole lot of computers that are on the same network, they should be on the same site if they're all connected by a high speed. But if you've got a remote site, let's say that you're in Melbourne like I am, and that you have a site across in New Zealand, you would treat that as a separate Active Directory site, because you wouldn't want all of the domain controllers in Melbourne directly replicating with domain controllers that were sitting in Auckland. You would want to make sure that the replication occurred between the Melbourne domain controllers and there was a bridge across so that all of the replication didn't occur, like all of these domain controllers were on the same networks. The next one is managing security principles. And security principles is a fancy way of saying users and groups, and understanding how users and groups accounts work in multiple domains and multiple forest scenarios. How you manage group managed service accounts, that is a feature that's been with Windows Server for a while, that instead of having a user account function as a service account, how you can set up a special type of account where the password's automatically managed for you. And then how do you join Windows servers, not only to on-prem Active Directory, but how do you join a Windows server to Azure Active Directory domain services, which is a special type of Azure AD, as well as standard Azure AD, and the scenarios where each is appropriate. Then we will talk about this idea of hybrid identity, where you've got one identity that you want to use on-prem and in the cloud. So how do you do that? Well, you can use Azure AD Connect. You've got to manage synchronization of those identities. How do you use Connect Cloud Sync, which is a newer technology that allows you to do a slightly different way of doing this? How do you integrate Azure Active Directory, Azure ADDS, and Azure AD? How do you manage Active Directory? How do you manage the connection and the synchronization health? How do you decide what the appropriate form of authentication is for your hybrid and on-premises environment? Do you actually understand what protocols are available if you're just using Azure AD versus using Azure ADDS versus using on-prem AD? How does LDAP work? How does Kerberos work? And then basic Active Directory stuff. How do you do group policy? How does group policy work when there's conflicts in policy? Knowing, does a domain policy have precedence over a policy applied at the organizational unit level? How do group policy preferences work? Next one we're going to talk about, the next part of the exam, is managing Windows servers. So we start with this new tool, Windows Admin Center. What do you need to know about setting up Windows Admin Center as your primary administrative environment? How do you configure a machine to be managed by Windows Admin Center? How do you configure PowerShell remoting for remote administration using PowerShell? What are the protocols and the authentication components needed for doing second hop remoting? And how do you use just enough administration for PowerShell remoting? And then what about managing Windows servers and workloads using Azure? So this first one, Windows servers in a hybrid environment, was very much an approach of managing from on-prem up to the cloud. This second one is about managing stuff from the cloud down to on-prem. So that's where we're thinking about things like Azure Arc, Azure Guest Policy Configuration, Azure Virtual Machine Extension. So how are you managing your IaaS VMs in Azure, but also using tools that exist in the cloud to manage your Windows Server workloads on-prem? So the next one is manage virtual machines and containers. We start with how do you go and manage Hyper-V and all of the elements that are involved in managing Hyper-V. Then we moved on to creating and manage containers, because in Windows Server 2016, we got containers that you could run on-prem. And by the time Windows Server 2019 came out, you could run both Linux and Windows containers on-prem. And then when Windows Server 2022 came out, you could do Kubernetes on-prem using Windows Server. And then what about managing virtual machines that run Windows Server in Azure? So what do you need to know about managing data disks in the cloud? What do you need to know about when you resize an Azure virtual machine? What about continuous delivery of virtual machines? How do you configure remote administration for virtual machines? Do you use Azure Bastion? Do you use just-in-time access? And then what do you need to know about a virtual machine's network configuration? Then we move on to hybrid networking. So not only does this functional group deal with everything related to your on-premises networking, that is DNS, zones and records, DNS forwarding, and DNSSEC, but also managing DHCP and IP address management. How do you manage your address spaces when you have networks in the cloud and networks on-prem? How do you make sure that servers always get the same IP address? Some of this stuff you've been doing for a long time. Some of this stuff is brand new. So it's important to understand that this particular certification is really combining a lot of that old school existing knowledge with a whole lot of the new knowledge that you have with hybrid stuff. So it's been interesting watching a whole lot of people talk about understanding, oh my gosh, I understand how to do DHCP, but what I don't understand is about VPN connections. And in the next one, we actually come in and we look at VPN and hybrid network connectivity. How do you actually get remote access working? What's an Azure network adapter and what does that do? What's Azure extended network? What's a web application proxy? How does Azure relay work? If you've got workloads running on-prem, but you want to expose them to the cloud, what are your options of doing that? Not just how do you have workloads that are running in the cloud that you want to access from on-prem. And then the final part of this first exam is administering Windows Server storage and file services. So this is your absolute basic, how do I manage a file server? And file servers are critically important. You might not know this, but the most common form of server in the world is your humble file server. File servers are everywhere. Every organization's got multiple file servers. They've probably got more file servers than they've got domain controllers or web servers or anything else. It's the old file server. And my first job as a network administrator in 1996 was managing an old Banyan file server. So configuring, manage Azure File Sync. And Azure File Sync for me is the technology that really represents what hybrid cloud is about. That's the one that when you turn it on, it basically turns your file server into a front end for the cloud, and it replicates and it synchronizes all of your on-prem files up to the cloud, only keeping the most recently accessed ones cached on-prem. And then suddenly you've got infinite file server storage. And then you can have multiple endpoints around your network, and those multiple endpoints allow you to have exactly the same files in multiple locations without worrying about distributed file system, which is a bit old as a technology and never in most environments worked as well as everybody hoped it would. And then let's look at managing your standard file shares. How do you configure file share access? Because people still get this particularly wrong. And I'll get to some of the questions after I get through all of these particular bits and pieces of the exam structure. So how do you configure file screens? How do you block someone from writing a particular type of file to a file share? How do you configure quotas? And then we look at storage and understanding how storage works in Windows Server. Not just your simple disk, but how does a storage spaces work? How does storage spaces direct work? How does storage replica work? How does SMB direct work? How do you configure storage quality of service? Then we move into the second exam. So the first exam is dealing with all of your core services, securing your Windows Server, all of your authentication, networking, storage, management, compute, all of that. The second exam, and we expect you to take it second, deals with what we're going to call advanced services. Now, the exams are of roughly equal difficulty. It's just that you're probably going to be less familiar with some of the topics in the advanced services exam, simply because they're the stuff that you probably use a little less. So the first one that we talk about is how do you do security? And this was important for me to get onto these exams because it's been a long time since security has been a topic in a core Windows Server exam. That is one that made up the core certification. So here we have a security functional group. The first is how do you secure the Windows Server operating system? How do you use all of these things? The Windows Defender application control, endpoint, credential guard, what smart screen? How does that work? How do you improve operating system security just by configuring group policy? Then we talk about how on earth do you secure Active Directory on-prem and in a hybrid configuration? Then how do you remediate Windows Server security issues using Azure services? This is one of the other advantages of the cloud because instead of having a forefront product that you used to have that would manage all of your antivirus or a third-party product, you can now go and plug in all of your on-prem stuff into all of this cloud technology. And the cloud can go and say, hey, the security configuration of these particular servers is not best practice. If you do this, you're going to improve the security of these things. That you can monitor all of the telemetry, all of the security telemetry, and centralize it. In the old days, if you wanted to figure out where someone had authenticated against a domain controller, you either needed to be centralizing your logging or using a different set of tools to figure out which domain controller authenticated a user. Now you can go and collect all of your security logs together and analyze them at an organizational level across on-prem and cloud. And it's also worth thinking about in this objective that your weakest link is where your security is worse. And if you've got perfect cloud security, but you've got a hybrid environment, an attacker's going to go after your on-prem. If you've got great on-prem security, but terrible cloud security, your attacker's going to go after where the weakest stuff is. How do you secure your Windows Server networking? We start with stuff like firewall, but we talk about things like domain isolation policies and understanding what a connection security rule is, that one computer will only talk to another when it's fully authenticated. And then how do you secure storage? Anything from BitLocker to recovery of encrypted volumes, to how do you use Azure disk encryption on your IaaS virtual machines, and how do you manage the disk encryption keys? So if you've got BitLocker on-prem, you can go and store your BitLocker keys in Active Directory. Well, what do you do with your BitLocker keys in Azure for standalone virtual machines? The next one is high availability. So we go and start with failover clusters. So how do you manage and implement a Windows Server failover cluster? Now, those of you who are a bit cluey or a bit well-versed in Microsoft technologies will be aware of another product that we've got called Azure Stack HCI, which is a fully hyper-converged operating system where you deploy nodes, and a lot of this stuff is taken care of for you. And at some stage in the future, and I can't promise that we're going to do this, but we're working towards it, we will be looking at an Azure Stack HCI specialist certification that you would take in addition to this. But you need all of this basic understanding before you can understand what Azure Stack HCI does. So Azure Stack HCI has built-in failover clustering. And all of the aspects that are related to failover clustering. How do you manage failover clustering? And then things like, how do you update nodes in a cluster? How do you upgrade cluster nodes? Because we've got a thing called rolling cluster upgrades now. How do you install updates and make sure that you maintain availability of workloads? And then storage spaces direct, which is a highly available version of clustered storage. How do you configure that? What are the characteristics of that? How does it all work? Next, we talk about disaster recovery. So how do you back up and recover your on-prem and your cloud Windows Server workloads? What are you, if you want to make sure all of your on-prem workloads are backed up and then the recovery points are stored in the cloud? How do you configure backup policies? How do you make sure that Azure virtual machines are actually being backed up? How do you recover a file just from the virtual machine that's backed up in the cloud instead of recovering the entire virtual machine? How do you recover a new virtual machine, and how do you restore an existing one? Then we talk about Azure Site Recovery. So in terms of configuring Azure Site Recovery, how do you go and configure it so that if you've got on-prem workloads and they fail, they can fail over to the cloud? Or if you've got workloads in one data center of Azure, it fails over to another data center. So all of the things you need to do to set up that. And then we can also talk about Hyper-V Replica, where you might have virtual machines replicating from one site to another, from Melbourne up to Sydney. And then in the event that Melbourne gets hit by a power outage, that everybody can flip over and start using the Sydney site. Then we talk about migration. And interestingly enough, for all of the Azure exams, we actually haven't done much in the way of how do you actually migrate workloads from on-prem to the cloud. And in this particular functional group, there's several objectives related to different things. So migrating data and storage. How do you use storage migration services? So storage migration services you can use to migrate from an old server running Windows Server 2003 to a new server running Windows Server 2022. So if you've got a file share on an old 2003 box and you just want to move it to a 2022 box, you can do that with storage migration services. Or you can go and move that share into the cloud. So how do you deal with all of this? How do you go and migrate to Azure file shares? How do you migrate on-prem servers to Azure? What do you need to know about performing that migration? How do you migrate workloads from previous versions to Windows Server 2022? So this is almost more of an upgrade story, except for, as you might know with Windows Server, we prefer that you migrate a workload off an old server onto a new server rather than performing an in-place upgrade. And one of the reasons for that is that there's usually only a skip upgrade available. That is, if you've got Windows Server 2012, you can only go to Windows Server 2016, but you can't go to Windows Server 2022 directly from Windows Server 2012. And also, it usually makes more sense to perform a migration from one server to the other, because if something goes wrong, you can always fail back to the original server, as opposed to if you're doing an in-place upgrade, that becomes a more complicated operation. So how do you migrate Internet Information Services from an old server to a new version of the operating system? Remote desktop servers. How do you migrate DHCP servers? How do you migrate print servers? You migrate Internet Information Service that might be sitting on that perimeter network so that they're running as a web app in Azure. How do you containerize an existing workload that's running on IIS? You might have IIS running on Windows Server 2008 R2. You shouldn't be running Windows Server 2008 R2, but you might have it there. And you might be thinking, well, instead of migrating this to a brand new Windows Server 2022 server, I want to containerize that IIS app and then deploy it as a container on Windows Server 2022 or deploy it as a container in the cloud. And then this is also important. It's not one that's been covered on too many Windows Server exams in the last 20 years, is how do you migrate Active Directory from a previous version of Active Directory? Let's say your domain controllers are running Windows Server 2008. How do you migrate that so all of your domain controllers and your forests are all the domain controllers are running Windows Server 2022? What do you actually have to do to move your domain controller so that they're running the latest version of the operating system? Now, the final functional group in this second exam is monitoring and troubleshooting. And again, we've had some monitoring in these exams, but we haven't had too much about the actual troubleshooting process, which is kind of interesting because the vast majority of IT work is troubleshooting. It's solving problems. So how do you monitor Windows Server using the Windows Server tools and the tools that are available in Azure? And here we're talking about everything from system insights to event logs to log analytics through to Azure diagnostics. How do you go and troubleshoot hybrid networking? So if you can't make a connection to your VPN, what's the tool that you use to do that? Hint, it's Network Watcher, because Network Watcher will actually do VPN troubleshooting and express route troubleshooting. How do you troubleshoot Windows Server virtual machines? And there's a whole lot of tools. And one of the reasons that we say that Azure is the best place to run Windows Server, other than the fact that we're Microsoft and we created both of them, is that if you're running a virtual machine in Azure, there's all of these extra tools that come and become available to your virtual machine. And there's a whole lot of routines and things that you can do. How do you troubleshoot your boot failures? How do you troubleshoot performance issues? How do you troubleshoot an extension issue? How do you troubleshoot if your disk encryption is not working? How do you troubleshoot if your storage is not performing? And then finally, how do you troubleshoot on-premises Active Directory? Because we've all got Active Directory in our environments, but very few people these days remember how to actually troubleshoot it if something's going wrong. So how do you restore objects from the recycle bin? How do you recover the Active Directory database? And when do you recover the database versus recovering from the recycle bin? How do you recover sysvol if it becomes corrupt? how do you troubleshoot replication? If you've got a domain controller that for some reason is not replicating with the other domain controllers, how do you go through and troubleshoot and figure that out instead of just blowing the domain controller away and putting another one back in? How do you troubleshoot if someone can authenticate to an on-prem resource but can't authenticate to a cloud resource? And then how do you troubleshoot generally on-premises Active Directory? Anyway, so what I'll do now is I'll stop sharing and I will start to answer some of those questions. So hopefully you are seeing just me on the screen. So I'm not sure if you guys want to read them out or I should just read them. So the first one is from, and I'm sorry if I am pronouncing this wrong. And yes, if you first about the Star Wars collection, if you go to orinthomas.com, you can see a link to all of my collection of science fiction stuff. The next one is a comment about the new certification. If one did not have any Windows Server knowledge and required the knowledge, one would simply have to become certified at MCSA, let me just read this. It does require, so how do you learn it? Well, you can learn it all on Microsoft Learn. There's also going to be Microsoft Pressbooks. There are also going to be instructor-led training for all of these objectives. So there's 2 courses that are being released that are updates of existing Windows Server 2019 courses that actually takes you through this. Now, what we don't actually have at the moment is something that's the really basic level stuff, which is how do you, what's a user and so on. But we've also found that the vast majority of people taking these certifications at the moment do actually have a degree of understanding. We may, if this certification proves popular, come in with a Windows Server fundamental certification that's a bit like the Azure fundamental certification. And I'm saying maybe. I've got no idea if this will ever happen. And that would cover the absolute basic stuff, like this is what a user account is sort of thing. Okay, the next question is Adrian's. Can you guarantee passing AZ 800-801 if someone has previous knowledge and AZ 104? I can't guarantee that anybody's going to pass anything because it depends on how you are on the day. There's certainly going to be some aspects of this that are not on AZ 104 and are not in the Windows Server 2016. There's actually a lot of material that is not there. There's a lot of material that's not there. So if you go look at it AZ 104, there's a lot of very general material about virtual machines, but it's not actually very specific about Windows Server stuff. So a lot of the troubleshooting stuff is not there. A lot of the Azure AD domain services is not there. So you have to understand that you'll certainly have a good grounding, but are you guaranteed to pass? You're never guaranteed to pass. There's people who work at Microsoft who take these exams that don't pass, even though, because they've got great knowledge about certain areas, but they don't know other areas, and that's what they trip up over. Now, we've got Kirill has said, oh, look, the old courses WS011 and WS012 didn't have exams. In AZ 800 and 801, we have mixed questions. Now, what's happening is that there is brand new remixes and updates of WS011 and WS012, which will, I believe, be numbered AZ 800 and AZ 801 or something similar, that will actually cover this material. And those 2 courses are actually being refactored along the lines of the exam objectives, so that the material is in the first week is going to be covered by the first course of first exam, and the one in the second course will be the second exam. So at the moment, yes, they're spread across those 2 courses, and you'd have to take both of them to take both exams. But I believe sometime in January or February, those courses will be retired, and the new courses that replace them will have the content separated in a different way. Okay, so let me just go down. Okay, so both exams combine all our previous knowledge in Windows Server in an extended way. Both are now betas. If I pass, the next day is the AZ800 beta, and I get the AZ801 months later, and let's say it won't be beta anymore, will I get the certification? Absolutely. So if you pass a beta exam, that sits on your transcript as a fully normally passed exam. So if you just did AZ800 this time, and then came back to AZ801 6 months later, you would then achieve the entire certification. Okay, so are there any more questions that anybody would like to ask?
Well, and if there's no questions at this point, there might be questions in the future. And if during the next few minutes people have questions, please ask them in the chat window or in the poly that Jejin just launched. Thanks a lot, Orin. I think this was very helpful, very clear. It's a great overview on the certification and on the exam objectives. And I'm sure that people now have a better insight on what the certification is about and how they should prepare for the exam as well. And I hope that everybody has become eager to take this certification, because I know that I, but also the other members in the LLPA are very happy about this new certification, bringing back the Windows the server certification in this hybrid form. And indeed, as you already mentioned, there will be 2 new courses designed by Microsoft Learning. They will probably be launched by January. At least that's the latest information that we have, and it will indeed be an AZ800. Yeah, it was supposed to come end of December. Now it's end of January, but more or less in let's say in Q1 of the next calendar year, early Q1. 2 courses that can help prepare you reaching this certification or passing the exams. And I will in a few minutes show you some offers that our members in multiple countries have to support you in reaching that exam. But before I do, sorry.
I've also heard that some of the exam test providers already have practice tests available for the exam as well. So I'm not sure if it's MeasureUp, but it might be MeasureUp that I think I read on Twitter already has a practice exam. I know that, for example, Pluralsight is putting together some courses. In 6 months' time, there'll be some books from Microsoft Press that'll also help you prepare. But at the moment, I recommend that people actually go to the study guides that I've got published, which will push you straight into the relevant Learn modules and docs articles.
Yeah, that's certainly helpful, and I'm sure that our members with the different offers, the various offers that I will present, will also make sure of the available measure of practice test, of the to prepare best for the exam, and also use the study guides that are available. So that's very helpful. But before I go to the office, let me do a brief description or explanation of what LLPA is, just for the people in the group to get an idea and who to turn to if they want to have support in passing one of the exams and reaching the certification. First of all, it's important to know that the LLPA, the Leading Learning Partners Association, is a global organization, a member organization with 31 members from all over the globe, working together in supporting customers in their digital transformation. For instance, with services like hybrid learning that we can offer. Especially hybrid learning is a good way to study for an exam if you already know something from technologies and you don't need a full course. And our members can support you with that. Well, like I said, all members are spread from all over the globe. 31 members covering the LATAM area, covering APAC, covering Middle East, Africa, and Europe. And we have delivery partners all over the globe. So we can support practically any customer and any student in this. And we're well connected to, of course, Microsoft. and not only with Microsoft Learning, but also with the product teams and the MS Learn team. And LLPA can provide you with a single point of contact for your international projects, but also provide you with a single point of contact in the local countries that you work with. And we can provide training in any language also in that country, of course. And on the screen, first of all, here you see some customers that we did business with, either internationally or in the countries where our members are. And if you look at the slide with our members, I'm sure you will find a learning partner here that you used to work with. These 31 members, they can provide all kinds of training and certification services, skilling services, as we also tend to call them, in your country. And if we look at the global operations, all these members, they can support you in any of those countries highlighted on the map. And if you're not sure which member to turn to, you can always go to llpa.com/members and find the member in your area.
I used to teach at DLLS. So DLLS was one of the, I taught for 10 years at DLLS as an instructor.
Yeah, exactly. Well, DLLS is one of the members of LLPA in Australia, indeed. Yeah. And then let's go to some of the offers of our members, and they're all around training and certification for this cloud, this hybrid Windows Server hybrid certification. First of all, Compass XNet in Slovenia, they offer training in Slovenian, and if you book a course, you get a free certification exam. Of course, I need to mention here that if you want to get more information on the offer, you can always scan the QR code on the screen. Same counts for CompuTrain in the Netherlands. If you book a course, either the AZ800 or 801, just like for Compass, you get a free certification exam, and you can book courses for instance, for events in March. Then Cloud Team offers a free exam voucher also when you sign up in January for one of the courses. And the offer is valuable until the 31st of March. And you need to use the coupon code Windows Server Exam. And last one on this slide is Semos in North Macedonia, Serbia. And they offer you also free exams if you register for a course on AZ800 or AZ801. And on the next slide, we have 4 other offers. For instance, ThinkSmart in Bahrain and the Gulf area. They offer you 50% discount on a training when you register for this training in December. Pipeline in Italy, you get a 30% discount on courses plus exam in the time frame of February and March. Then ETC in Austria, they offer you a 10% discount on the AZ800 and 801 courses until the end of March. And last but not least, CTU in South Africa, they offer a 20% discount on the courses that are scheduled for 7th of March when you're using the code WebAZ21. A lot of offers, a lot of support that our members can provide you if you need some extra support to prepare for the exam. And this brings me to the end of the skills talk. I don't know if there's any other questions, if any other questions came in. Orin, did you?
I don't see any on my screen, no. So I assume if you want to get in contact with me, aka.ms/Orin will bring you my webpage on Microsoft's website that's got all my contact details, so you can connect on LinkedIn or Twitter or however you feel like.
Perfect. And thank you very much, Orin, for this great presentation. I'm really sure that people now know what this certification entitles. And thank you all for attending. It was very good to see so many of you attending this presentation. And I wish you all good luck in pursuing your Windows Server hybrid certification. And have a nice day and have a nice evening. And if we can support in any way, just let us know and use the QR codes. Thanks a lot for attending and have a nice day.
Good night, good evening, goodbye.
Bye-bye.